We all have our favorite Halloween traditions. For some, it's putting up those signature decorations every year. Others love fall festivities like corn mazes, pumpkin patches, and bobbing for apples. But by far my favorite thing is revisiting my favorite classic horror films. And frankly, some of my favorite memories of the Halloween season involve seeing the great classic horror films for the first time. I'll never forget how terrified I was watching the first kills of the creature from the Black Lagoon, or how jaw-dropping the visual effects in The Invisible Man were, or how taken I was with the creativity of King Kong. Truly, those films made me feel like I was sucked into an uncanny world of fantasy and chills. However, there is a detriment to seeing all the classics. First viewings can be a special thing, but once you've seen all the big-name films, it can be hard to recapture that excitement. Where do you go once you've seen all the classics? Well, you delve into unknown territory, and look at some movies that haven't achieved an iconic status. And that's what this video is for, to shed some light on certain horror movies that I think have been overlooked by not just the general public, but by horror fans too. Most of these picks probably won't enthrall you the same way Bride of Frankenstein or Cat People did, but in my opinion, they're all worth anybody's time. So sit back as I look at 10 overlooked classic horror films. For the sake of variety, I'm going to designate a different category for each slot. So for the first one, let's go back to horror movies' infancy in the silent era. Whenever you look up the greatest silent horror films, the same titles tend to pop up. Phantom of the Opera, Nosferatu, The Golem, and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari always seem to have a slot on everyone's list. And deservingly so, they're all fantastic films. But the big reason you see them a lot isn't just due to the quality, but because of the quantity too. What I mean is, most films from the silent era don't exist anymore. According to the Library of Congress, 75% of all silent films are lost, either because they were misplaced or because they were destroyed. The nitrate film stock that early movies were shot on was highly corrosive and flammable, so if it wasn't stored under ideal conditions, it was destined to be ruined. These factors are what makes finding hidden gems in the silent era so tough. There just isn't a big pool of movies to explore. However, if you look hard enough, you're bound to find a couple. I'm happy to say I definitely have. Although not my pick for this spot, one of the more interesting discoveries is A Page of Madness, a 1926 Japanese silent film about a man who takes a janitorial job at an asylum, just so he can be close to his wife, who's been committed there. What follows is an assortment of nightmarish visuals that tread a fine line between horror and surrealism. Another great contender for the spot is The Bat from 1926, a haunted house caper about a jewel thief who dresses himself up as a bat and sneaks through a mansion using various gadgets. The film was famously remade as The Bat Whispers in 1930, and inspired Bob Kane to create his famous comic book hero, Batman. Another seldom talked about silent horror is Haxan, Witchcraft Through the Ages. It's a series of vignettes that explores the folklore of witchcraft throughout history. Sometimes it takes a more informative approach to the material, and at other times it goes for pure fiction. The blend is excellent and makes for one of the most unique horror films of the era. But the one I always come back to from the silent era is The Cat and the Canary. The Cat and the Canary is what I call the pinnacle old dark house film. You have a dark and stormy night, secret passageways, and a mad killer on the loose. It doesn't get any spookier than this. I loved it as a kid, I love it now, but I always wished there were more films that captured this similar aura. Little did I know that almost 10 years after I first saw this film, I'd find another one. And it just so happens to be my pick for the number 10 slot, The Last Warning from 1928. The Last Warning is actually a follow-up to The Cat and the Canary, recycling the same director, crew, tone, and certain cast members. Studio head Carl Laemmle hoped to recapture the success of The Cat and the Canary, but The Last Warning received a lukewarm reception from critics and the general public, causing it to languish in obscurity for many decades. Personally, I find The Last Warning to be just as enjoyable as The Cat and the Canary. It follows the cast and crew of a new Broadway play. During the premiere, a member of the cast is murdered. 5 years later, the play's producer decides to revive the project at the very venue the murder occurred at. Of course, when they start rehearsing, things go awry, and everyone begins to suspect each other of being the murderer. The film is a visual playground of eerie images and kinetic camera movements. Not only does this help keep the movie interesting, but it makes the runtime fly by. A standout moment is a sequence where the main characters are locked in a room where smoke is quickly filling the air. They break the door down, and behind it is a stranger in a mysterious getup, but we see it out of focus and only get a glimpse of strange blurry movements. Even 9 decades later, this moment is still striking to see, and it's just one of many visuals that pop into my head when I think of this film. I will admit that some of the performances don't hold up. The film was intended to be a horror comedy, but most of the jokes don't land. But I do think many of the hammy performances help remind modern audiences not to take the premise too seriously. You're just supposed to sit back and have fun. That being said though, I do think the exception is Laura LaPlante as the lead. Much like in Cat and the Canary, you can tell she's frightened traversing through this creepy theater, but she does her best to hold herself together. She has moments where she feels frightened and screams, but they feel like genuine reactions rather than over-the-top freak-out moments, which her co-stars have constantly. She's easily the most likable character, and you have no problem following her until the end of the film. A fun fact about the cast is that LaPlante's love interest is played by John Bowles, who would go on to play Victor Moritz in James Whale's Frankenstein 2 years later. Like The Cat and the Canary, The Last Warning just radiates a playfully spooky atmosphere. A heavy hand at accomplishing this are all the theater sets, which, interestingly, were all reused from the Lon Chaney Phantom of the Opera. Every room is littered with cobwebs, dust, and rotting furniture. It all looks fake, but that's part of the charm. Without this set decoration, the film would feel bland and uninspired. The filmmakers allow the camera to linger in many of these areas, which further immerses the viewer into the story. It also helps to create a subtle sense of looming dread that pervades over the characters. Unlike most horror films from the era, there's no discernible creature for the characters to fear. There's no iconic makeup or mask to strike fear into the hearts of the viewer when it's on screen. At least, not for the majority of the runtime. Things seem to move without rhyme or reason, and some characters question whether or not there's actually a murderer, or if it's all in their heads. Because of that, the film relies heavily on atmosphere, and it delivers on that better than most horror films from the silent period. That alone makes The Last Warning worthy of a spot on this list, and essential viewing for any fan of silent horror films. We started at the beginning of the classic era, so now let's go to the end. There's a debate on when exactly the classic era of horror films ended, but most people agree that the death of the Hays Code in 1968 gave birth to the modern era. All films no longer had to abide by the same rules. Some films could be more mature in their content, and others could be more graphic. This is when you start to see films like The Exorcist, Halloween, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre hit the market. I agree with the notion that the classic era ended with the death of the Hays Code, but honestly, I think a lot of these quote-unquote modern films are also considered classics. After all, if you look at kids in costumes today, you're bound to see just as many Draculas as you are Jason Voorhees. Voorheeses? What's the plural for Voorhees? It's not important. And with the 70s being 50 years ago, it's kinda hard to call a lot of these movies modern. For me, I consider the end of the Hays Code the end of one classic cycle and the beginning of a new one. I could make a whole video about that, but let's save that for another day. So for this slot, I thought I'd choose a movie from after the Hays Code ended. This might be a broad category to choose from, but when you think of horror films from the 70s, 80s, or 90s, most people think of slasher films. And with good reason. Most of the big horror icons from this period were slasher villains, like Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Leatherface, Michael Myers, Ghostface, and that's just a couple names from the list. There is no shortage of underrated slashers. In fact, there are tons of lists online dedicated just to that subject. Black Christmas, Deep Red, and The Funhouse are great horror films that have appeared on said lists. But there's always one I barely see appear, and it's one of my absolute favorite horror movies from the 70s. For those reasons, it has to take the number 9 slot, an obscure 70s slasher called Alice, Sweet Alice. The film follows a single mother with 2 troubled daughters. The younger daughter is murdered on the day of her communion, and the older daughter, Alice, becomes the prime suspect. The mother is skeptical of her older daughter's guilt, but as more incidents occur, the mother too has trouble believing Alice is innocent. Like other iconic slashers of the time, this was an independent film. Its low budget and on-location filming gives the movie a grimy, naturalistic feel. This helps elevate the overall drama, and makes it feel like we're eavesdropping on the squabbles of a real family. With that being said, it's a far cry from some something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre that utilized guerrilla-style filmmaking to give it a documentary feel. You can tell a lot of sequences were painstakingly mapped out, and the craftsmanship doesn't go unnoticed. There are many beautifully composed shots that are mesmerizing yet haunting to look at, particularly in the church. I find it interesting that this is one of the brightest sets in the whole film, and yet it comes across more unnerving than some of the darker spaces. Probably the creepiest aspect of the film is the killer. Like any great slasher villain, they quietly stalk their prey and never say a word. Unlike some of the more iconic villains, this killer doesn't take their time. They're quick and aggressive. Not only that, but there's a brutality to the kills that make them seem more threatening than the average horror movie killer. But above all, they have a really creepy mask. The fact that it's partially transparent just gets under my skin every time I look at it. The acting from the cast is great too. Linda Miller, who plays Alice's mother, does a stellar job trying to keep her sanity amongst all the havoc going on in her life. You sense her inner turmoil as she struggles to find answers about her two daughters. There are moments in the film where she starts to lose it and screams at people who accuse Alice of the murder. These parts are especially captivating. You can sense her struggle with every cry she lets out. The younger sister is played by Brooke Shields in her film debut. She's good, but the standout is Paula E. Shepherd, who plays Alice. Surprisingly, she only made one more film after this. I'm shocked because she steals every scene she's in. Throughout the movie, Alice lashes out and is prone to emotional outbursts. These don't come out of nowhere, as we see she's treated unfairly at home and gawked at by a creepy neighbor. These factors make her outbursts more motivated and genuine. You believe that this girl could have some emotional trauma and could be capable of such a heinous crime. Even all these decades later, Shepherd's performance still holds up, and is one of the biggest reasons this movie works so well. These factors make Alice Sweet Alice stand out when compared to similar films of the era, and because of that, it should be mandatory viewing for any horror fan. We started at the beginning, jumped to the end, and now I think we should reach beyond the United States. Yeah, whenever most people talk about the history of horror films, the conversation is very US-centered, and that's kind of understandable. I mean, the Universal monster movies from the classic era left a cultural imprint around the globe, but they aren't the only movies from this period to do that. The vivid gothic horrors of British studio Hammer showed the world how color could aid in a horror film. The German expressionist films of the silent era showed how movies could adopt a nightmarish tone. And of course, the kaiju films of Japan, like Godzilla, showed the world how destructive a giant monster could really be. But there are tons of great horror movies from around the world that didn't leave as big of a global impact. Onibaba, Vampire, and Eyes Without a Face are movies that have influenced countless filmmakers and continue to astound newcomers every year. But I think all of them are too famous to earn a spot on this list. My first instinct would be to go with one of the early Mario Bava horrors that helped set the foundation of the giallo films of the 70s and 80s, but even many of those are still pretty well known. It's tempting to pick the Russian horror film V for its rich atmosphere and eye-catching visuals, or one of Brazilian filmmaker Jose Mojica Marin's Coffin Joe films for their surprisingly gory nature and malevolent main character. But for me, a foreign horror that I feel isn't talked about enough is a Mexican film from 1934, and it's called Phantom of the Monastery. After getting lost in the woods on a dark and stormy night, a group of friends find refuge in a mysterious monastery. The Covenant is run by a devout group of monks who have no problem letting the group stay the night, but it's clear to the main characters that not everything is what it seems, both with the monks and maybe amongst themselves. The film isn't as provocative as some of the other films I previously mentioned in this slot, but one of the most astounding aspects is how well the film conjures up an atmosphere. It's similar to Universal's The Old Dark House in both its mood and soundscape. What I mean is, there's an uncanniness to the setting that's only enhanced by the constant sound of lightning and rainfall, although the film does have a score to accompany it too. The more the characters explore the monastery, the more intriguing it becomes. And what's creepier is the fact that the film was shot in an actual monastery. Knowing that just makes my skin crawl every time I look at these images. The filmmakers also love to play around with shadows. The movie is meant to look like it was lit entirely by candles, which helps give the movie a style that's well ahead of its time. I can't think of any horror movies from this era that look as ethereal as this. It's hauntingly hypnotic. The monks themselves do a great deal to enhance the discomfort of the film. Their movements are very deliberate, their cadence lacks any sort of vigor, and even when they aren't on screen, you can feel their presence. But with all that being said, they never feel threatening. You never get a full sense of what their intentions are. If the monks were wild, weird, or a bit maniacal, we would easily guess that they intend to harm our leads. However, since the monks still come across as somewhat normal, they feel disarming in a way, which brings more suspense to the story. The film does have a slower pace, but it reminds me of some of the early 30s horror movies like Frankenstein or Freaks. This movie feels like a worthy companion piece to those early sound horrors, and makes you wonder if there are other horrors hidden from this time that are just waiting to be unearthed. Until more are found, Phantom of the Monastery is more than good enough to hold anyone over. Alright, for this next slot, we're gonna think big. Giant, even. Giant monsters, that is. Although there were giant monster movies in the silent era, the subgenre really didn't strike a chord with audiences until the 1950s. Many, including myself, consider that decade the golden age of giant monster movies, so I think we should pick something from that decade. Fans of kaiju films might be disappointed because even though the giant monster craze started in the 50s, it exploded in the 60s, leaving us only a handful of very famous choices to sift through. These are films like Rodan, Baron the Unbelievable, and Godzilla. Honestly, I feel like even the most overlooked kaiju films are still relatively well known, so I'd like to go a little more obscure. For me, the enjoyment of these 50s giant monster movies comes down to the effects. Sometimes it's fun to sit back and watch something hokey like The Beginning of the End with its real-life grasshoppers, Attack of the Crab Monster's model that barely articulates, and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman's woman. But don't let these few examples set a precedent over other giant monster movies. There are plenty from this era that have some impressive effects for their time. Tarantula uses a real-life spider and does a great job blending it in with the real-life scenery. Them has some well-made animatronics that move around and have some weight to them, and feel genuinely threatening when shot at the right angle. The monster that challenged the world's mollusks may have been an odd creature to make giant, but those close-ups make it feel real and organic. Also, the carnage it leaves behind is pretty chilling for the 1950s. But as good as these effects are, the effect that always captivated audiences was stop motion. It was great in King Kong, and even better in some of these. First instinct for a giant stop-motion monster would be to pick one of Ray Harryhausen's films, like 20 Million Miles to Earth, It Came from Beneath the Sea, or The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, but all of those are rightfully beloved. However, there is one stop-motion monster film that I constantly see neglected by horror fans, and it just so happens to have some effects supervised by Willis O'Brien, the legend who animated King Kong, and that film is The Black Scorpion. This movie is often lumped into the so bad it's good category, and I never understood why. Maybe it's because it was done on Mystery Science Theater. The plot revolves around a duo of geologists who travel to Mexico after an earthquake occurs. What they don't realize is that the earthquake has released a pack of giant prehistoric scorpions that are now on the loose and consuming everyone in sight. The film certainly falls into some common B-movie trappings of the day, like taking itself too seriously, having long explanations of scientific phenomena, and having a little kid as one of the side characters. But I'll be honest, even if the scorpion effects were terrible, all these pitfalls still wouldn't be that bad. What I mean is that I've seen worse, and these elements are far from terrible. They're mostly just dated. The characters are above average for a film of this kind, and two of them are played by familiar faces from other monster movies. That's Richard Denning from Creature from the Black Lagoon, and Mara Corday, best known for Tarantula and The Giant Claw. But of course, the highlight is the special effects. And luckily for us, there are plenty of monster sequences. You have scorpions attacking people, trains, and even each other. They do not disappoint. The first attacks genuinely creeped me out as a kid, and for the 50s, this is pretty graphic. The scorpion battle sequences have always been my favorite part. They're well choreographed and actually convey a key plot element, which sounds like that should be a given for any movie, but for these, it honestly was kind of a rarity. To me, these scenes are just as entertaining as King Kong battling with the T-Rex. On top of that, there are actually some other monsters in this, a giant tentacled worm, and a trapdoor trapdoor spider. It was rumored for a long time that these were reused puppets from the now lost Spider Pit sequence from the original King Kong, but Ray Harryhausen and others have said that those models were still at RKO at the time. However, their designs match photos that still survive, so it looks like O'Brien at least reused the designs. The craftsmanship of the Black Scorpion is well above many of its contemporaries. For that alone, it deserves more recognition. The quality of its story and characters are just nice bonuses to go along with it, and I'm sure more horror fans will think the same way if they give this a try. Another staple of 50s monster movies was aliens. Whether peaceful or hostile, the 50s was full of intergalactic invaders. Some slick-looking, some campy, and some that are overlooked and waiting to be rediscovered. The 1950s gave birth to a new wave of independent studios and producers, so there was a huge influx of sci-fi and horror movies. Some of them cheap, and honestly, some even laughable in their efforts. Many of the impressive alien invader movies from independent studios are well regarded and fondly remembered. Films like Invaders from Mars, The Blob, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers are all genuine classics. However, there's another film from that era that I feel should be grouped in with that list, and the film just so happens to be my number 6 pick for the slot. It's The Man from Planet X. Scientists at an observatory in Scotland have discovered a new planet in our solar system, which they give the temporary name of Planet X. One night, a rocket crash lands on Earth, and just so happens to be carrying an inhabitant from Planet X. Both the alien and scientists try their best to communicate with one another, but to no avail. Tensions mount when one of the scientists, devilishly played by William Schallert, starts to torture the man from Planet X in order to gain some of its intergalactic knowledge so he can publish the findings for himself. What's great about this movie is its approach to the material. The man from Planet X doesn't land and immediately start attacking humans. It tries to communicate with us. The alien style of language is completely different from ours too. It communicates via musical tones. It brings to mind more modern alien films like Arrival and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Not only that, but when I first saw this movie, I felt a little of the Day the Earth Stood Still influence on it. But when doing research for this video, I found out that this came out before The Day the Earth Stood Still. 5 months prior, in fact. So a lot of the ideas I thought they stole, they actually did first. Visually, this is one of the most unique sci-fi films from the 50s. It all takes place at night and makes great use of shadows. All the exterior sets are cloaked in fog, which gives it a gloomy atmosphere. There's also some creative camera movements and blocking. This is all the more impressive when you learn that the reason the film was shot this way was because they were trying to hide the fact that these were all reused sets from the 1948 Ingrid Bergman film, Joan of Arc. That fact just makes the movie more impressive in my eyes because you never would have guessed that they did this just to hide its cheapness. These felt like conscious choices the filmmakers made for stylistic purposes. I think this stylish look can be attributed to the film's director, Edgar G. Ulmer. Ulmer was an auteur known for making Z-grade material and imbuing it with artistic merit. Some of his more well-known B-movies include Bluebeard, The Amazing Transparent Man, and Detour, which is considered one of the greatest film noirs ever made. To me, this is another impressive achievement of his that should be held in higher regard. Oftentimes I hear people say that the man from Planet X himself has a silly design, but I think he's much better than most of the aliens from the era, and to be honest, I think he's kinda creepy. The design falls into the uncanny valley because of his humanistic features. The lighting on his face helps to create some interesting shadows, and I genuinely love how his facial expression never changes. This of course is due to the cheapness of the mask, but seeing him walk around with those cold dead eyes makes him unsettling to watch. But another man worth talking about is William Schallert. Schallert is one of the most prolific character actors of all time, having over 300 acting credits to his name. You've probably seen him in tons of movies and TV shows and never noticed him. I was the same way until I saw this film. As I said before, he plays a devious scientist who only cares about boosting his reputation. Every time he's on screen, you know he's about to do something despicable. Schallert plays him with just enough malevolence to where he never goes over the top. Most of his actions are subtle, which helps him get away with things. Every time he does something cruel, you just hate him more. This guy is as conniving as he is intelligent. There are times where he discovers information about the alien, but he hides it from his colleagues so he can use it to his advantage. It makes him such a captivating antagonist, because most scientists from this era were either misguided, mad, or the rational thinker. Schallert's character is well aware of his misdeeds, and is unlike any villain from a movie of this type. For that and more, I think the man from Planet X deserves more attention, and is an easy pick for this slot. Before audiences were terrified by aliens, they were scared of monsters. But the idea of monsters existed long before movies came around. Many of them originated in folklore and superstitions. So for this spot, we're going to focus on a movie that takes one of these famous monsters and creates a compelling story that is often overlooked. Werewolves are brought up a lot when talking about underrated monster movies. However, most of the truly underrated werewolf films popped up way after the 1960s. The few good werewolf movies from the classic era are well known, and the more obscure ones, well, they're obscure for a reason. Believe it or not, the most popular monster in the silent era was the Mummy. There's a surprising amount of mummy movies from that time. Unfortunately, most of them are lost, so we can't see what made these creatures so appealing to audiences. There are a few good underrated mummy movies from the sound era, like The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Shroud, and Hammer's 1959 remake of the Karloff classic, The Mummy, but those are all still relatively well known. It's tempting to pick one of the more obscure pieces of folklore like zombies, but when I say zombie, I'm not talking about the flesh-eating corpse. I'm talking about unlucky souls that have fallen under voodoo spells and have their free will stolen from them. Two of the great zombie movies are White Zombie and I Walked with a Zombie. However, I think I have to go with a movie that depicts probably the most popular monster from folklore, the vampire. Vampires probably have the best track record when it comes to creating new and original stories. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm pretty sure vampires are the most filmed monster. There are a ton of underrated vampire films from the classic era, like Mark of the Vampire, Isle of the Dead, Black Sunday, and The Kiss of the Vampire, but the one that blows them all out of the water is The Brides of Dracula. It follows a French school teacher who takes a job in Transylvania. Unfortunately, she's abandoned by her coach driver in a small town. Having nowhere else to spend the night, she accepts an invitation from a local baroness to stay at her castle. While there, she discovers the baroness's son chained up in a room. He claims his mother locked him up because she's insane, but has been telling the townsfolk the opposite. The school teacher breaks him free, but it turns out neither is insane, he's just a vampire. The school teacher flees from the castle and just so happens to run into Van Helsing, who instantly believes her story. The big problem with this movie is the title. Dracula doesn't appear in it. Van Helsing does, but Dracula is nowhere to be found, which is part of why it was so dismissed when it originally came out. However, if you go into this movie knowing that information, you'll find that it's a first-rate chiller. This is the second Dracula film made by Hammer Studios. Their previous film, Horror of Dracula, had Christopher Lee in the title role, and the film was an international sensation. David Peel plays the lead vampire in Brides of Dracula. He's no Christopher Lee, but his character is more fascinating for modern viewers. Dracula is one of the most depicted characters in film, so when we see a new incarnation, there really isn't much mystery to him. Every facet ever conceived with him has been explored. David Peel's Baron Meinster brings back that aura of mystery. You find yourself begging to know more about his backstory and how he became afflicted with the vampire curse. Like any good movie, it gives you just enough to keep you enticed the whole time. But he isn't the only interesting character. This is probably the most multifaceted characters Hammer's ever had in one movie. The school teacher, played by Yvonne Monlar, doesn't fall into many of the female horror stereotypes at the time. She's curious, strong-willed, and pretty smart. Sure, she gets tricked by Peel, but you understand why. He comes off as genuine and appeals more to her caring nature. It's a strategy that I think many people would fall for. And having a villain outsmart an intelligent lead always makes for great conflict. Frida Jackson basically plays a female Renfield in this, but her servitude feels less like an innocent person under a spell and more like an obsessed follower. This gives her a creep factor that surpasses many other characters of this nature. Probably the best example is when she lays on top of some of the vampires' coffins and whispers into them. Martita Hunt plays the Baroness, who is one of the most complex characters. She can't find the strength to kill her son once he's become a vampire, but she's more than willing to sacrifice an innocent stranger every once in a while to keep him fed. There's an underlying tragedy to her that's masked by her coldness. Truly, there are very few antagonists like her from this era of horror. Of course, the best character in the film is Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing. He steals every scene he's in, and is so good that it makes you wish Hammer continued making Van Helsing films rather than Dracula movies. There's a gravitas to Cushing that makes him enthralling to watch. Seeing him slowly discover more about these new vampires is just as thrilling as any action scene. His performance helps to elevate every scene he's in too. Even when the dialogue doesn't always make sense, Cushing's cadence gives it a validity that further envelops the viewer in the story. I'm not the first person to say this, and I'm sure I won't be the last, but this is one of the best looking Hammer films. The color really pops in every scene. Usually I think shadows look better when they're photographed in black and white, but the color cinematography complements the darkness and creates a menacing mood that's unlike any horror film previously made. In fact, most of Hammer's later films fail to live up to the visual splendor this film conveys. Not to say their later films look bad, but Brides of Dracula is as lavish as it is haunting. For those reasons and more, Brides of Dracula is mandatory viewing for any classic horror movie fan. Of course, when we think of classic horror films, our minds immediately go to the Universal monster movies. And who could blame us? Frankenstein, Dracula, The Invisible Man, The Mummy, The Wolfman, and The Creature from the Black Lagoon are all just as entertaining to watch today as they were back then. Even many of their sequels are beloved by horror fans. But what people often forget is that Universal didn't only make horror films revolving around these monsters. Their horror catalog is more extensive and not showcased to the degree the monster films are. Some get a decent spotlight, like the Edgar Allan Poe films. These are Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Black Cat, and The Raven. Most of them, though, languish in obscurity. Some for good reason, but others have redeeming qualities that would pique the interest of any horror fan. Man-Made Monster is noteworthy because it stars Lon Chaney Jr. in his first horror role. Yeah, before he was the Wolfman, he was the Man-Made Monster. Tower of London showcases 3 great performances from Basil Rathbone, Vincent Price, and Boris Karloff. The historical setting allows for them to delve into different types of characters and demonstrate their range as actors. Captive Wild Women sheds a light on an unknown monster franchise in the Universal Library. It follows John Carradine as a mad scientist who turns a wild ape into a beautiful woman. Not really that interesting, but what is interesting is the fact that there were 2 sequels to it, Jungle Woman and Jungle Captive. I was really close to choosing Flesh and Fantasy for this spot, an anthology film that has quite a few A-list actors in it. Edward G. Robinson, Charles Boyer, and Barbara Stanwyck are just a few recognizable names. But what if I told you there was a Universal horror series that not a lot of people know about? It was called The Inner Sanctum Mysteries.
This is the Inner Sanctum, a strange, fantastic world.
The Inner Sanctum Mystery was a popular radio show that ran from 1941 to 1952. It was an anthology program that mainly focused on mystery stories, but they would often dip their toes into horror. Universal purchased the screen rights in 1943 and made 6 films in the series, none of which that were stories that were featured on the program. Lon Chaney Jr. starred in every film as a different character each time. The series is generally considered a missed opportunity by Universal, as many found the films underwhelming. For me, with the exception of the last film, Pillow of Death, I find these films easy to sit through and fun to watch. Strange Confession is often considered the best of the series, and although I think it's one of the better ones, it's probably the least horror-themed out of all of them. Following a scientist trying to help create a vaccine for influenza, but his greedy boss is trying to rush the product before it's ready. For me, I think the best one is easily Dead Man's Eyes. Chaney plays an artist who's caught in a love triangle. After an accident renders him blind, his future father-in-law promises that when he passes away, Chaney will get his eyes, and his sight would be restored. Not too long later, the father-in-law turns up dead, and Chaney is found at the scene of the crime. Its simple setup generates an excellent web of mystery and intrigue. Each of the suspects are given strong reasons for wanting Chaney to have his eyesight restored. This keeps the audience guessing the whole time, and inevitably leads to a satisfying payoff. Although the movie was made quick and cheap, director Reginald Borg managed to sneak a couple memorable shots in there. I especially love his use of close-ups. Most of the movie is filmed in long and medium shots, which all look pretty standard, but when he chooses to punch in, he does so to great effect. Even something as simple as a hand holding a nail seems fascinating to look at through Le Bourg's lens. Le Bourg also makes great use of subtle camera movements. The film mainly consists of people talking in the same few locations over and over again. Under a less skilled director, these scenes could have become real boring real fast, but with some carefully chosen camera moves and blocking for his actors, Le Bourg is able to give most of these scenes some much needed momentum. Lon Chaney Jr.'s performances in these movies have been picked apart by past and contemporary critics, and I can't say I don't see where they're coming from, but I will say, I don't think these performances are as bad as people make them out to be, especially in this one. I mean, he plays a man who makes a living through solely visual means, and now he feels stranded because his sight is gone. Not only that, but he has to adjust to a radically different way to live life. It's a big adjustment with a lot of uncertainty for him. I can see why he may be a little over the top sometimes. Now, I'm not going to act like this performance is stellar and will change your perception of Lon Chaney Jr. as an actor, but I will say this is one of Chaney's better roles. It's one of the more complex characters that he's played, and Chaney does a decent job exploring his plight on screen. It's a nice hidden treasure in Universal's library that any horror fan should get their eyes on. The classic era was full of iconic monsters, but you can't have iconic monsters without some equally iconic performers. And that's what this slot is going to talk about, some of the legends that help bring to life these creatures of the night. But we're specifically going to highlight another horror performance by one of them that's been overlooked. First things first, we need a star. Actors like Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Vincent Price, without exaggeration, have hundreds of credits to their names, which makes finding obscure films relatively easy. But many of the ones that are overlooked come way after the classic era, so I think we'll have to go with someone else. It's tempting to go with an actor often forgotten as a horror star like Claude Rains. Rains made his leading man debut in The Invisible Man, and is one of the big reasons that movie is regarded as a classic. And I know people will say he moved on from horror, but throughout his career, Rains would occasionally come back to horror films. When Rains starred in The Wolfman, it wasn't due to a career slump. He had just starred as the title character in Here Comes Mr. Jordan, and his film following The Wolfman would be King's Row. So it's clear Rains didn't feel starring in horror movies was beneath him. But I do think I have to go with one of the big three. Who are the big three? Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and Lon Chaney Jr. Had it not been for these performers, horror history might be drastically different. These gentlemen's careers were made with horror, and all ended with them. So I think it's feasible to find an overlooked gem in their filmographies. Many film scholars have said Lon Chaney Jr. was at his best when he played characters with a tragic element to them. His performance as the Wolfman in 4, technically 5, of the original Universal monster films is proof enough that the public loved him in that type of role. Other examples of this being used to his benefit are in Man-Made Monster and Dead Man's Eyes, but Chaney has some eye-catching performances in horror films that don't retain a tragic quality. He's genuinely creepy as one of Vincent Price's servants in The Haunted Palace, and in Spider Baby, he gives a delightfully over-the-top performance that just makes him fun to watch. However, none of these roles come close to the gravitas of Lugosi or Karloff's underrated performances. Bela Lugosi is someone who suffered from bad roles and even worse directors. Every once in a while, Lugosi would be able to elevate the parts he was given by collaborating with a director who understood his strengths. Probably the best examples of this are his performances in the classics Son of Frankenstein and White Zombie. But it doesn't stop there. Both of his collaborations with Lou Landers led to spectacularly spooky performances in The Raven and Return of the Vampire. Saul A. Goodkind and Ford Beebe were able to guide Lugosi into giving one of the best mad scientist portrayals in the Phantom Creeps movie serial. And one that I'm glad to see getting more attention lately is Lugosi's collaboration with a young Joseph H. Lewis in The Invisible Ghost, where Lugosi descends into fits of calculated homicidal rage when he sees what he believes is the specter of his deceased wife. But for as good as Chaney and Lugosi are in their underrated roles, Boris Karloff easily has the more eclectic filmography. Karloff seemed to be luckier than Lugosi and Chaney when it came to scripts and characters. His filmography is so vast that it's easy to find hidden gems. Some that I see brought up a lot are The Walking Dead and The Old Dark House. Karloff is good in both, but these were still pretty early on in his career where studios just wanted him to be a lumbering monster. He's given meteor roles in Bedlam and Isle of the Dead, where he brings a wonderful malevolence to both of his characters that you just love to hate. My original pick for this slot was The Man They Could Not Hang, where Karloff goes from an ambitious scientist to a murdering psychopath after the general public sabotages his latest experiment to help humanity. It has some great themes and character journeys in there, but before I started writing this, I rewatched a different Karloff movie, one that's just a little more famous than The Man They Could Not Hang, but I couldn't help but give it the number 3 slot, and it just so happens to have Bela Lugosi in it, and that is The Body Snatcher.
Look,
Look at yourself. Could you be a doctor, a healing man with the things those eyes have seen? There's a lot of knowledge in those eyes, but no understanding.
Based off a story by Robert Louis Stevenson, Karloff plays a grave robber who sells freshly buried corpses to a local doctor, played by Henry Daniell. Daniell uses the corpses to conduct his newest experiments on, and keeps asking Karloff for more and more bodies. It's a risky business sneaking into cemeteries and digging up corpses, so Karloff decides to look for an alternative method to retrieve cadavers. This is actually a pretty well-known movie, but I feel like it isn't talked about enough. Karloff's performance is easily the strongest aspect, and I'm surprised he never got the chance to play a similar character again. He played a lot of mad and evil characters, but never one as cocky and arrogant as John Gray. You don't get a sense that he enjoys digging up bodies, but you get the feeling he loves that it's Daniell who's asking him to do it. Daniell is a snobbish, educated man who clearly looks down on those who are lower class, and views them as degenerates. But Daniell himself is breaking the law by having Karloff dig up bodies, something that many at the time would think is immoral. Karloff sees the hypocrisy and enjoys being a constant reminder of it for Daniell. One of the best scenes is when Daniell runs into Karloff in a pub, and Karloff calls him Toddy, a name Daniell doesn't go by anymore. Karloff keeps throwing the name in Daniell's face and relishes how irritated it makes him. Daniell can't do anything to stop him because Karloff could go to the police whenever he wants and rat out Daniell. This unique dynamic is what makes Karloff delightfully sinister to watch. You can tell Karloff enjoyed every second of making this film, and that enjoyment is felt by the viewer. There are a lot of scenes where Karloff is smiling, something I now realize he doesn't do a lot in movies. When he does it here, it makes him more enticing to watch. He isn't just a brooding baddie whose only thought is of malicious intent. He has a range of emotions that makes him feel like a regular person. This quality, of course, is what makes him more unsettling to watch. There are plenty of scenes where Karloff is shrouded in shadows and evokes an ominous nature. It doesn't take much to wipe away his smile and reveal the evil that lies beneath. When that grimace appears, you know you're in trouble. You can tell that if he doesn't change his mood soon, everyone around him is going to suffer. With that being said, there are other great aspects to this movie, like the script and the cinematography, but Karloff is easily the highlight and what most people leave the movie talking about. I said earlier that Bela Lugosi is in this movie, but honestly, he isn't given much to do. It is cool though to see Karloff and Lugosi share one last movie together, and their last scene is a chilling one. This is easily the most dynamic character Karloff's ever played, and although the film is not unknown, it isn't as highly regarded as it should be. When it comes to horror, people should know Karloff for Frankenstein, The Mummy, and The Body Snatcher. For as much enjoyment a good movie can provide, just as much enjoyment can be had from watching a bad movie too. So for this next slot, I'm going to talk about movies that are so bad they're good. Movies like Robot Monster, The Terror, and Plan 9 from Outer Space are the reigning kings of this category, but there are easily more bad movies out there than good, so it's easy to overlook some hidden gems. Well, gem isn't really the word I'm looking for here, but you know where I'm coming from. Some of the great contenders for this list are The Screaming Skull, Killers from Space, The Phantom Planet, Blood Feast, The Deadly Mantis, Devil Doll, and The Monster and the Girl. Originally, I was going to choose The Killer Shrews due to its lackluster choice in Monster and because the plot gets more outlandish as the film progresses. However, when I was doing research on that movie, I found that a lot of people have actually seen it, more than some of the more famous so bad they're good movies. I'm not sure if it's because it's in the public domain or because it got more exposure by being on Mystery Science Theater, but due to those factors, I've decided to go with a film that, according to many movie sites, less people have seen and is more baffling to watch. A film that I thought was more universally known as a so bad it's good movie, and that film is The Giant Claw. The US is baffled by a series of sightings and attacks by an unidentified flying object. They become even more baffled when they find out it's a giant alien bird creature that's said to be as big as a battleship. Famously, producer Sam Katzman wanted Ray Harryhausen to do the special effects of the giant claw. It most definitely could have happened because both men were working at Columbia Pictures at the time. But Katzman was a B-movie producer and didn't have the budget to hire Harryhausen. So he went with an effects house in Mexico City to create a marionette puppet, and this is what they came up with. Even back then, this was considered a poorly designed creature. It looks more like a villain that would pop up in a children's puppet show like Howdy Doody or Diver Dan. But this wacky design is only part of the appeal of the movie. It's not just the look that's funny, it's everything around it too. The screech is laughably bad. Sometimes when it attacks people, there's a bone-breaking crunch. That's one of the most gruesome sound effects you could use in a death in a 50s horror movie, but it's paired with this. It's impossible not to laugh. Even the miniatures are pathetic. My favorite is when the giant claw picks up the train and you can tell it's just a children's toy. What makes it even funnier is the acting. Not that it's bad, some of it is dated, but as far as 50s B movies go, it's definitely better than most. But they take the threat of the giant claw so seriously that it comes off as comical. It gives off the same vibe as Leslie Nielsen in Airplane, oblivious to the ridiculousness happening around them. To be fair though, their serious demeanors came from the cast not knowing what the giant claw was going to look like, so they had to use their imagination. Even original posters and lobby cards never showed the creature. The only description you hear the characters mention in the movie is that it's a bird and that it's as big as a battleship. A phrase the screenwriters were a little too proud of if you ask me.
Flying battleship.
Flying battleship.
But something as big as a battleship.
Your flying battleship?
A bird as big as a battleship.
We're hitting a battleship with a slingshot.
Your flying battleship.
A bird as big as a battleship.
You're flying battleship.
I said it looked like a battleship, not that it was a battleship.
Oh, and did I forget to mention it has an invisible antimatter shield which makes it invincible to most of our weapons? I am not joking. Now, there are plenty of goofy monsters from this period, some even worse looking than the giant claw. So why choose this above the rest? Well, this movie is a lot of things, but it is never boring. The script moves things along at a relatively quick pace, its dialogue scenes don't drag on too long, there's quite a bit of action, and unlike many cheap monster movies from the time, they actually show the monster in a lot of scenes. Yeah, if you've watched enough old monster movies, you'll find that lots of them don't like showing their monster. You know, the whole point of buying your ticket. Even some of the ones with great designs failed to do this. So despite its shortcomings, the giant claw is actually pretty watchable. In my eyes, it's the perfect schlock movie. It has a goofy monster, cheap special effects, memorably bad lines, and is just as fun to watch on repeated viewings as it was to watch the first time. And here we are, the number 1 slot. For this pick, we're going to go as simple as possible when talking about horror. Everybody has been afraid of something at some point in their lives. It can be something very common like bugs, or something very specific like puppets. But I think at one point or another, everybody has been alone in the dark and heard something go bump in the night, a phrase usually associated with ghosts. Ghosts are the most timeless creature depicted in horror. The oldest ghost stories date back to Mesopotamia, and new ones are produced every year. Even though every generation seems to be scared by something different, ghosts have managed to be a constant presence in horror media. I think part of the reason many of these ghost films haven't achieved iconic status is because they lack an identifiable monster. You see, the best ghost films from the classic era relied on what the audience couldn't see to send chills down their spine. Sometimes you'd get glimpses of spirits here and there, but for the most part, it was just unexplainable invisible forces at play. Probably the two best examples of this are The Innocents and The Haunting. Both are films that follow disturbed female protagonists in supposedly haunted houses, and in both cases, it's debatable whether or not the houses are truly haunted, or if it's all happening in our main characters' minds. Both of these movies are masterpieces, but there are some amazing ghost films made before these that are often forgotten by horror fans. One of my favorite films of all time is The Uninvited, a fantastically creepy film about two siblings who buy a haunted house, and now must help the spirit find peace. There's an unnerving aura to this film that fills you with a sense of dread. It perfectly utilizes quiet moments to build suspense, and rather than ruin it with a loud noise, it just keeps on building. It's probably the creepiest film from the classic era, and I remember being so happy when Criterion gave it its first ever home video release. This helped give it a much needed boost in exposure, and has allowed for more frequent showings on TV in October. However, it's because of that newfound exposure that I can't pick it, because there's one other film that I hold in the same high regard that I feel more people should see, and it just so happens to be my favorite horror anthology ever made, Dead of Night.
Milk and sugar, Mr. Craig. Milk and sugar, Mr. Craig.
Still there. So it isn't a dream this time.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, it isn't a dream this time. I must be going out of my mind.
It follows an architect who travels to a country house to meet with the owners about some potential renovations. When he arrives, he experiences some major déjà vu, recognizing the house, its inhabitants, and even events that are seconds away from happening. This intrigues everyone, who then share their own stories of unexplained/supernatural occurrences. What follows are 5 stories of the macabre. I actually reviewed this movie my first year of doing my 31 reviews in 31 days, but that was over 8 years ago, so my thoughts have changed a little since then. If you're curious what I thought about about that movie back then please click the description below. Something I feel I didn't talk about enough in my initial review was the framing story. It's one of the best aspects of the film. Other horror anthologies tend to connect their stories with a narrator or one mysterious character who tells all the tales. Here, each segment is instigated by a different character, and the tone of each tale reflects that. Not everybody tells a story in the same way, and these stories are presented in different manners. It's kind of like sitting around a campfire in the middle of the night and having everyone go around telling ghost stories. There's a fun familiarity to it, kinda like the architect in the house. The content of each story is diverse too. Each tale isn't a typical ghost story. Some are explicitly about spirits, while others only suggest the presence of them. And sometimes you're not told explicitly what's going on. The viewer can be just as puzzled as the narrator, which creates empathy and adds to the horror. But let's talk about the stories real quick. The first one follows a man who, after suffering a terrible injury, has a premonition of his own doom. He sees a mysterious man on a hearse call out to him,
Just room for one inside, sir.
It's based off a short story called The Bus Conductor, which was later adapted into the Twilight Zone episode 22. It's the shortest of the 5, but it's full of chills and gets the ball rolling for the rest of the movie. The next story revolves around a girl playing sardines in a big mansion at a Christmas party. Whilst hiding, she stumbles upon a hidden room and meets a little boy whom she doesn't remember seeing earlier. It's a quiet story that relies more on creating a haunted atmosphere that makes your skin crawl. The third story is about a woman who buys her husband an antique mirror for his birthday. When he looks into it though, he finds himself in a strange room he's never seen before. As the days go by, the husband starts to lose sense of himself and acts out against his wife. This one dips more into psychological horror and showcases 2 powerhouse performances by Googie Withers and Ralph Michael. The fourth story is a dark comedy, featuring Basil Radford and Naughton Wayne as 2 golfers who fall in love with the same woman. They decide to settle the matter with a game of golf. Winner gets the girl. Radford wins, and Wayne doesn't take it too well. Wayne comes back as a ghost and haunts Radford because he found out Radford cheated. When I was younger, I was not a big fan of this story, mostly because I didn't find it very funny. Now that I'm older, I still don't think it's funny, but I can appreciate the filmmaker's attempt to make the stories diverse. And honestly, I can't imagine the film without it. Plus, there are plenty of people who very much disagree with me on this not being very funny. To each his own, I guess. And although I enjoy all those stories, my favorite is easily the last one, The Ventriloquist Dummy. It follows a ventriloquist who recalls a series of strange incidents involving another ventriloquist, played by Michael Redgrave, and his dummy, who is named Hugo. Redgrave has an odd relationship with Hugo. He's always anxious when he's in the same room as Hugo, and talks about Hugo like he's real. Redgrave gives what's probably a career best performance. There are so many subtleties to his demeanor that help enhance his character's mental deterioration. He's always twitching, darting his eyes, and his voice cracks so naturally that you don't even notice it on a first viewing. That's a hard thing to fake, but Redgrave does it with ease. On top of that, there's a veil of ambiguity that permeates over the whole segment. It's genuinely hard to tell whether Hugo is really alive or if it's all in Redgrave's head. This aspect is what makes the story so brilliant. The segment is full of so many subtleties that it makes rewatching it a rich experience. Like I said before, the stories are all strong, but this is my favorite. There's enough of a variety in this movie to where I think anyone can walk away with something they liked. And that's the biggest reason for me giving it the number 1 slot. There are so many aspects to this film to enjoy, and it's shocking that it's not more well known. So if you'd like to add some new classic horror films to your watch list this Halloween, I recommend starting with Dead of Night, for all the reasons I've listed before, and so many more you're sure to discover while watching it. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and be sure to subscribe.